G'day viewers. So life in lockdown is pretty hard, as you can tell. So I thought I might use some of my spare time to make something and show you how I make it and maybe inspire you to make one too. What I'm going to make is a Glasgow Buckler, which is something that's been on my list for a fair while now. What is a Glasgow Buckler, you ask? And the other honest answer is no one knows. Not for certain, because it's mentioned in the whole of the historical record exactly once. In the mid-16th century, as part of the equipment of sort of lowland troops garrisoned in the Highlands. Oh, hello, button. So, things we can deduce about the Glasgow Buckler is, one, it was a buckler and not a target. For a start, targets were still a relatively new thing at that period. They were around, but certainly not in widespread use, and they wouldn't have got them mixed up. They're very different sorts of shields, so presumably it was actually a buckler. Second thing we can deduce about it comes from the fact that Glasgow was later on a centre of sort of high-end Taj making, where all really nice leather worked studded Tajes tended to come from Glasgow. And so, presumably the bucklers were decorated in a similar fashion, and that's what made them a Glasgow Buckler. Evidence for this is there's at least one Highland grave slab, which I'll put up now. Where you can see that buckler looks like it is decorated in pulled leather and studs in the same way that later Tajes were. So it was obviously quite pretty. So chances are that's what a Glasgow Buckler was, and on that basis I'm going to make one in that style. Bucklers are, I will say, easy to make. And my original buckler, which I made 30 years ago, possibly more, is still going strong and basically untouched. So if you make a buckler and you do it right, it will last a lifetime. So hopefully this will inspire you to make your very own Glasgow Buckler. In order to make my buckler, I'm starting with a circle of wood and a boss, okay? And I've already cut out the circle of wood. It's a good sort of 30 centimeters, so it's a reasonably largish buckler, which is what I want. And I have carefully centered there and drawn a circle equivalent to the inside diameter of the boss, which is going to go on there. So my first job is to drill a nice big hole in the middle of that and jigsaw out the middle. That didn't take very long. There's the hole. I'm now going to spend a little bit of time taking off the rough edges. Okay, so what I want is to get rid of the sharp corners. I want to get rid of the sharp corners on here because that will help the edging survive longer when I put the edging on. So I'm going to sand down the corners on both sides of that, and I'm going to sand down the corners on what's going to be the inside face of this. So that can be a sharp corner there that can sometimes snag your wrist and be unpleasant. So again, I'm going to shave down all around there to make that nice and smooth. I don't need to bother on the side that's going to be the face of the buckler, but on the back of the buckler, having this at a bit of a nice smooth angle is worth the effort. Now, with the help of a sanding wheel on my angle grinder, I've smoothed down the edges of the buckler on both sides and on the inside rim where the boss is going to go, and that's just to make everything nicer. The next thing I want to do is the edging. Now I could get, say, some garden hose, split it down the middle and thread it on over the thing and just hold it on with tape. But I'm going to be a little bit fancy with this one, and I'm going to put some leather edging on. Now normally I'd go to the leather shop, I'd get a 6 centimeter wide belt strip, long enough to go all the way around in one piece. But, you know, I can't do that. We're in lockdown. I don't even know if the leather shop is open, and even if it is, I can't go there. So I have improvised and found enough spare leather lying about the shed that I've made 3 strips, which I hope, when strung together, will go all the way around the buckler. We'll find out. These are going to be soaked in hot water to make them nice and soft and squishy, and then I'm going to fold them on, and I'm just going to use a staple gun to staple them on all the way around the outside of the buckler, like so. And as you can see, 6 centimeters, it seems wide, but it's only just enough to go around this. So you want to make your belt strip nice and wide. An alternative, and I'll show you this, I've got a half-made Taj, I can show this on you, okay, which is this one here. This has rope, okay, I've got some rope which is the same width as the piece of wood this is made out of, which again I've just covered and taped all the way around there to give it an edge like that, because for this Taj I don't want, because they didn't have big thick edges, I don't want to give it a big thick edge, I want it to be nice and flat, so I've given it a rope edging there. That's an alternative, you could do that instead, but in any case I will go and soak the leather and staple it onto that, and show you what that's like probably tomorrow. Now edged, I did have enough leather to go all the way around, so then I've just pretty roughly tacked that on with the staple gun. Now if any of this was to be visible externally, I would then go around and tack it in with blue tacks and remove the staples, but I always use the staple gun because it allows you to put the leather on rapidly while it's still wet and flexible. In this case, of course, it's all going to be covered up, so I don't really care. So I'm just going to leave the staples to do their job. And so that bit of the job is now done. I will leave that in the sun to dry off and let the leather harden, which will make a really nice, strong, flexible, and yet resilient edge. So this is the bit of leather I've got spare that I'm going to use for the facing of the buckler. As you can see, it's much thinner and flimsier than the stuff I've used for the edging, but it's still the same sort of stuff. So I'm going to go and soak this in hot water in probably the bath. I can't think it's the only thing that's big enough, so that I can then put it over the top, fold it over and tack it on again with the staple gun initially. So I'm going to cut out a sort of a rough circle that's going to be big enough for me to fit over the buckler and fold over the edges to the back. Then I'll go and soak it, and then I'll tack it on, and then we'll see what it looks like. So now what I've done is I've tacked the leather on around the back, and you can see it's a bit bunched up at the moment. That's all right. And on the front, I've staple gunned it around there just because that's going to be covered by the boss, so it doesn't matter, and use some nice brass tacks to tack down just on the inside of the rim there. And I've done this while the weather is still wet, so hopefully it will tighten up and look rather nice. If you don't have brass ones, blue tacks will do. And the next thing I'm going to do is trim the excess leather on the back and throw in some blue tacks there to replace the staples. I have now done the back, and you can see it's looking a lot better. So I've used blue tacks to tack that down and really hammer the leather down to kind of smooth it out and cut off the excess ripples, and removed all the staples. So that looks authentically nice now. So that's the front, that's the back. Now I'm actually going to do the decorating. I'm going to do the stud work, okay? The leather I'm using to cover this is too thin to do any actual tooling, and it's not something I'm particularly good at anyway, so I'm just going to go with pretty studs. And I think I'll use the one on the grave slab as a guide to my decoration. And the reason I'm going to put the studs in now is I'm using upholstery tacks, and some upholstery tacks, I've got a whole range in there, I'm not sure what I'll use yet, I'll get them out and have a look, but some of them are longer than the thickness of the wood, and as you hammer them through they will stick through the back there, and so I want to be able to shave those off, grind them off before I have to put bosses and handles and other such things in. So the stud work actually comes next, so that's what I'm going to do now. This is a close-up of the buckler from that grave slab, which I'm going to base my design on. You can see it's got that sort of that thick rim, there's a central boss, and then there's a sort of 7-pointed star and in between the 7 points of the star, you've got a sort of a three-cornered knotwork thing. So there's probably some spiritual symbolism going on there with sevens and trinities and that sort of thing. So not entirely sure how I'm going to do the knotwork yet, but I'm try and get as close to that design as I possibly can. I've been working away on this all afternoon, and the sun is going down, so I'm about to lose the light, but I thought I might show you what it looks like in progress. So I've sketched out the triangular pattern in chalk, and have put upholstery studs around the outside. Now I'm working using some little nails to do the inner triangles. That's it in progress. It's not difficult to do, just time consuming, but you know, there are less pleasant things to do out in a lovely autumn day out in the garden. So that is the buckler with the stud work completed. I am now tossing up the idea of staining the leather rather than leaving it natural. I thought I might dye it, so that would involve sponging a lot of dye on and then sealing it. So I will go in the shed and see if I have the necessary materials on hand. If I do, I might dye it. If I don't, I'll leave it as it is. So I did indeed find a stain that I think looks pretty spiffy. So I've given it a couple of coats of that. I'll let it dry, then I'll coat it with a sealer, and then it'll be time to put the boss on. But it's looking much better. I've just put the boss on, and you've got to say, it's looking pretty spiffy. Now, if Mr. Pete is watching, he will berate me for using nuts and bolts rather than riveting it through with nails in the traditional fashion, but, you know, I'm making do with what I've got on hand, apart from which I like to be able to disassemble these things for maintenance. So the boss is tacked on just with those two bolts. I'll put some more in there, at least two of which will be going through the grip, which I've got to go and put on the back. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the success of this project comes down to the grip. So I want to talk about the orientation of buckler grips. So with the concave English buckler, the grips are oriented in such a way that the face of the buckler is held directly forward. So this is wider that way, thinner that way, so it sits in the hand with the palm of my hand supporting the face of the buckler like so. Okay, and for a buckler like this, that's really good. However, many bucklers that you buy orient their grips the other way. So if you have a look at this one, this is a fairly typical commercial one with a squished pipe kind of grip, and you can see that it's flattened out in that plane so that it sits in the hand like so. So the edge of the buckler is what is oriented forward. Now, the reason they are made like this, I presume, is because in sources such as 133, that's how the buckler is oriented. So if we look at my favourite medieval 133 buckler, which has done decades of sterling service, it sits like this. I can hold it, so it sits like this in my hand, and so I can roll around my hand and do cool 133 type things. And that works really well. But the grip on this buckler is not oriented like that. The grip on this buckler is essentially round. It's actually slightly hexagonal, slightly squarish, I would say, but it's not flat. It doesn't force me to hold it that way. I can choose to hold it that way, and I can choose to hold it anywhere in between because it's essentially a round handle. Likewise, my original 30-year-old homemade buckler, which you can see got a handmade boss out of I bashed that out of a sheet of metal 30 years ago because you couldn't buy bosses, you had to make them yourself back then. Otherwise constructed in exactly the same way as the new one, and that just has a round handle there, just a bit of dowel. And again, I can hold it like that, I can hold it like that, I can hold it anywhere in between. So, how should I orient the handle? Well, my first idea was to orient it a little bit like the English buckler, just because holding a really big buckler like that just feels wrong, okay? And so I thought, well, if that orientation is incorrect, maybe that orientation would be correct. So this is the first grip I made, like so. Okay, so it's a slightly rectangular shape, oriented forward like so. So it would feel very comfortable like that. But when I put it on the buckler, it felt, again, wrong. It felt like the orientation of the buckler was incorrect. So I took that off, and that's why I use nuts and bolts and don't rivet everything on, so I can take it off and fix it when I get it wrong. So instead I've made a round grip. So this is the buckler with the round grip on it, and I've just got some tennis racket handle wrap on there, just give it a bit of a grip, bolted on the front with nuts and bolts so I can take it off when I get it wrong. And now the buckler is finished, and it's quite pretty, as you can tell. It's got nice, hopefully authentic pattern on the front that matches the stone carving that I'm using as a source. Nice hand forged boss, nice dyed leather, nice thick edge, though that will get chewed up pretty quickly once I start using it. And with the round grip on it, it feels pretty good now. So I'm really happy with how that's turned out. So I'm going to go and use it.